Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll get started. Welcome to our morning newsmaker. Our guest will have a statement, and then he'll answer your questions. He said that he could be with us until 10 or a bit after. After that, he has to leave for an appointment. My name's Jack Reynolds. I have a media consulting and production company here in Washington. Our guest today, Chris Hani, is a man of many parts. He's the highest-ranking member of the African National Congress to visit the U.S. since Nelson Mandela's trip last June. Mr. Hani is a member of the ANC Executive Committee and Chief of Staff of the ANC's military wing called Spear of the Nation. He's one of the younger generation of the organization's leaders and is particularly popular with the younger, more militant segment of the anti-apartheid movement both in and out of South Africa. Mr. Hani is a Latin and English scholar who holds a BA degree from Rhodes University. He's also survived several assassination attempts, spent time in jail in Botswana, and for years he traveled secretly in and out of South Africa. Life is never dull for Mr. Hani. The South African government is now threatening to remove his indemnity from persecution for his political actions. That indemnity expires April 30th, and if it's not renewed, it would make him liable to arrest and trial upon his return to South Africa. Mr. Hani's visit to our country comes at a critical time since the U.S. Congress is scheduled to hold hearings on April 30th to assess the impact of sanctions mandated by the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. And there is a debate about whether those sanctions should be lifted or maintained. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hani.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure for me to address this press conference this morning. It is just over a year since the de Klerk government unbanned the African National Congress, the PAC, the party, and other organizations. It was an act of courage on his part after so many years of naked repression by his predecessors. We believe that the crisis which gripped our country for so many years at least made de Klerk a realist and forced him to take the only option that was available, namely to unban the ANC and to release the leaders of the ANC and to allow, even on a temporary basis, those who were in exile to come back. I think it is important to assess this period. What has happened in South Africa within this year since the ANC was unbanned? For the first time in our history, leaders of a liberation movement engaged a racist government in discussions on a basis of equality. We discussed the critical problems facing the country in an attempt to resolve the crisis of apartheid and racism, and to work out a new dispensation in our country. And that dispensation, of course, in our view, is a united, non-racial, and democratic South Africa. I think generally there's broad agreement on this issue. In their statements, the leaders of the Nationalist Party have expressed their commitment to a non-racial democratic South Africa. There are differences about the modalities towards this objective. The ANC is putting forward the idea of an interim government and a constituent assembly. It is our view that since the government is both a player and a referee, that position would not guarantee us impartiality. We had earlier in the year, called for an all-party Congress where the different groups would meet to discuss the broad principles of a new constitution. There was an agreement on this between the ANC and the Nationalist Party government, although the PAC and other organizations had reservations about this. As I indicated, ladies and gentlemen, there have been two major meetings with the government so far, culminating in the Grooteskir and Pretoria minutes. There have been various working groups composed of representatives of the government and the ANC. Agreements were hammered out on the release of political prisoners and the return of exiles. As you are aware, we also made a commitment to suspend armed actions and related activities. But as press people, you know that there's been an alarming escalation of violence in our townships, especially in Natal and the Reef, for the last 8 months. Statistics come out with chilling figures of the deaths, mostly of black South Africans. This violence has generated a lot of tension between the regime and ourselves. It is our view that the regime has not used its security forces to stop acts of violence mainly directed against black communities. It is also our view that at least on 2 occasions, the police themselves have participated in violence against the people. We see a government which is not taking adequate steps to punish police officers who connive at acts of violence. We are also very worried and indeed agonized by the existence of CCBs, Askaris, Kofut, and Battalion 32 in our country. We feel that these groups have got a right-wing orientation with very deep animosity towards the African National Congress. It is indeed our view that though the government is talking to us, it wants to talk to a weakened ANC and a fragmented African National Congress. It was with these fears that we addressed an open letter to President de Klerk, demanding, amongst other things, that he should legislate against the public display of the so-called cultural weapons, that he should disband the units I've referred to, Askaris, Kofut, CCBs, etc., and that the disbanding should be done by an independent commission. We also call upon him to dismiss 2 ministers we hold responsible in failing to curb the ongoing violence. In that open letter, we said that if our demands are not complied with, we shall pull out of the ongoing talks. Another area of concern on the part of the African National Congress is the issue of sanctions. White politicians, including the government in our country, feel that they've done enough to warrant the lifting of sanctions. They say they've already committed themselves to the scrapping of apartheid. And indeed, on paper, at any rate, they've repealed some laws. The victims of apartheid, the ANC, PAC, Party, COSATU, etc., are saying very little has happened in our country. Apartheid is still in place. was still ruled by a white minority, and that we have not reached a stage where changes are irreversible. We are saying it is premature to lift sanctions, and that sanctions should be lifted when we have been oppressed and we are still being oppressed, come out and say, we have now begun to negotiate in our country. So far, there are no negotiations. We are trying very hard to create a climate of negotiations. Part of my visit here, my tour, is to speak to Americans and say to them, please don't lift sanctions at this stage. They are an important area of pressure to make the regime move. I've had discussions with officials in the State Department and the White House, and we have put that message, we have conveyed that message to the administration. Finally, I want to say we are serious about negotiations, and of course we initiated negotiations. We have made important commitments towards negotiations, including the suspension of armed action. We feel that South Africa would be a better place if its problems are resolved in a peaceful manner. After years of destruction, after years of killing, after years of the imprisonment of our people. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think I should give you a chance to ask questions.
In the back.
So, on your open letter to the government and your demands, it's clear that your demands will not be met. Ministers Flock and Malone wrote the plan. That's the one question. How are you going to react to that on May the 9th? First, can I just add another question if I could? Then on the matter of your setting up defense units, AUC defense units, could you explain to me as Chief of Staff in controversies with, under what circumstances will those defense units act? What will constitute a provocation for them to act? And could you comment in that sense, Fred, to comment on that this is inviting us to come forward?
Excuse me, just 1 second.
Sorry, and then somebody will start to broadcast.
Thank you. If you could give your name and organization when you ask the question. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Leroux. You are saying that it's quite clear, and of course the press has equally stated that those 2 ministers will not be sacked. We are waiting for a response from the government, a considered response on all the issues that we have raised in that open letter. We have stated that we want a reasonable response because our demands are reasonable. We shall consider the totality of the response before we decide on any concrete action. So it will be premature for me to say, if Malan and the Flock are not dismissed, we shall do the following. We shall have to sit down as a movement on or just after May the 9th rather, to consider our responses. It is not for an individual like me to say we shall respond in the following manner. Coming to your second question, the issue of self-defense units. I believe that our decision to form self-defense units is as a result of our perception that our communities are not protected by the South African police. Now, it is a natural thing, and I think it is natural law, that when you feel threatened and endangered, you resort to your own methods of protecting yourself. It's like, for instance, if I'm attacked at my place and my family is in danger, I would not fold my hands. I would have to defend the family as best as I can. I do not want to simplify the issue. I understand your concerns and the concerns even of the American government, they were raised at our discussions yesterday. People are afraid of a Lebanon type of situation. We do not want to have private self-defense units accountable only to the ANC. We have gone around to discuss this issue with a number of organizations and with the communities affected. And I want to assure you that it is not just an aberration of the ANC. There are demands on the ground from the victims of violence that the ANC should do something about this violence, because the perception of the affected communities is that the police are not defending. Now you are asking me whether these actions are not going to degenerate into civil war, whether there won't be any provocation, and what would be the guidelines. We are going to be sitting down, and we have already sat down rather, to define the guidelines. The self-defense units are going to be totally defensive. We won't go and attack police stations or police and the army or blow up installations. We shall so organize that when some of these people or all these people come and attack, the people are in a position to rebuff those attacks in order for the attackers to feel that, you see, they're not going to have, they're not rather going to attack with impunity. I mean, this sort of thing is not like, conducting an experiment in a laboratory. We must make sure that we strengthen discipline and accountability. And strong measures or stern measures should be taken in order not to allow for the degeneration of self-defense units. We are also ready to discuss with the government the whole question of self-defense units, because we want to hammer an understanding, especially on the part of the whites, who do not understand the violence taking part in the township in our country, because they don't stay there. We feel that, you see, whites have organized some defense for themselves in the form of some civil defense units or even neighborhood watches, precisely because they want to protect themselves against crime and criminals. And the black communities, as far as we're concerned, are equally entitled to take measures to establish defense units, and would like the government in our country to have that sort of sensitivity, which they display rather, towards the white community.
Question here. I'm sorry, the lady here in the front row.
Seema Sirohi from SouthScan. Could you tell us who all you met in the administration, in the White House and the State Department, and what were the issues discussed? And also, could you clarify who's sponsoring your trip? Because some elements of the South African press have said that it's only sponsored by the Communist Party of the United States.
Thank you, madam. Yesterday, we had 2 meetings at different times. One with the State Department. The delegation coming from the State Department was led by Mr. Jeff Davido, former ambassador to Zambia, a man quite knowledgeable about the situation in Southern Africa. We explained our own perspectives, and especially dwelling on the issue of negotiations, explained the basic reasons behind our open letter to President de Klerk, and we explained and informed him on the current violence escalating in our townships. We said something about the interim government and the Constituent Assembly, as well as raising the issue of sanctions. They asked a number of questions on the issue of self-defense units and explained their fears about the possible negative effects of these self-defense units. They explained their position on sanctions, and that, you see, there was a possibility that some sanctions would be lifted. And of course, we're equally emphatic in making an appeal to them not to rush with the lifting even of some sanctions. With Mr. Fraser, it was the same approach, explaining to him in a detailed manner about the situation in our country as well as on the issue of sanctions. He also explained, like Mr. Davido, the position of the American government. Certainly, they were telling us that they are in a process of interlocution with all the parties in our country, with the regime in Pretoria, with us and other groups. I must say the talks were very friendly and frank, and I discern personally a serious concern on their part to make whatever contribution that they can make within their own limitations to bring about the proper solution of the problems of our country. Coming to the question of the sponsorship of my tour, our tour is sponsored by a coalition of groups in this country. Amongst those groups, of course, there's the People's Weekly World, the paper of the American Communist Party. There are also a number of coalition groups. When we were invited, of course, we jumped in accepting it because this enabled us to have a chance to inform the American people. I'm a member of the South African Communist Party, which has had very close and fraternal relations with the Communist Party of the USA. Whilst we're still banned and operating from exile, we worked together very closely. And for us, we don't have any problems about the inclusion of the American Communist Party and its paper in the sponsorship of the tour.
Question here.
Yes, Brad Phillips with Fairfax Public Access. There's been a lot of talk by members of your organization as well as yourself about political prisoners and exiles. Are any of these people responsible or associated with necklace murders, car bombings, or the assassination of moderate black leaders who have rejected the armed struggle of the ANC?
Well, amongst us in the course of prosecuting the armed struggle, our comrades who have certainly been involved in carrying out operations using car bombs, limpets, explosives, comrades who have used mortars and 122mm rockets against enemy targets. Because you must remember, we're fighting a war, and those weapons were certainly used in carrying out that war. Their comrades were involved in planting landmines against enemy targets. And in some cases, I want to be frank, civilians were caught in the crossfire. War is like that. I'm sure the recent experience of the Americans and their allies in Iraq will show that as they were trying to deal with Saddam Hussein, thousands of innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. Unfortunately, that is the ugly side of war, and we derive no pleasure in that sort of thing. Moderate leaders, I don't know what you mean by moderate leaders. Apartheid, in oppressing us, co-opted many blacks who were equally instrumental in our oppression. There were community councillors in the townships, for instance, who were carrying out the instructions of apartheid and were oppressing our people, evicting them from their houses and making apartheid to entrench itself. Some operations were carried out against some community councils in the course of that war. Of course, presently, there is suspension of armed actions. And we, as the ANC, so far since August, have not instructed any of our combatants to carry out any military action.
Reuters. You said that you were told by the State Department delegation that they were considering lifting some sanctions. It was possible that they would lift some sanctions. Did they give a time frame? Did they say which kind of sanctions they were considering lifting?
Well, they did not go into specifics because of time constraint. And we got the impression that in terms of time frame, they were considering doing so probably in another 2 months or 3 months' time. Of course, this was going to come before Congress. It would certainly be discussed, and I'm sure a number of views would be expressed. They were not detailed as to what sanctions and when these sanctions would be lifted.
The young lady here.
Chris Hani, the AP. To follow up on this question, we were told a while back that the only way the administration would recommend to Congress lifting sanctions was if the political prisoners were released by the end of this month. Was that discussed? Is there any possibility that that could still happen by the end of this month? And also, in your talks with members of Congress, I assume you've met some, what is your impression of which way the wind is blowing on the sanctions issue?
Well, I've not yet met any member of Congress. I'm likely to meet Senator Kennedy sometime this morning. You know that, of course, the American administration has pointed out that certain things have got to be done by the Pretoria government before sanctions are lifted. They have referred to the release of political prisoners and the return of exiles. And they have said that if 5 conditions or 4 conditions, I don't know out of how many, are met, they will consider lifting sanctions. Of course, we're intensifying the campaign to stop that because so far, not all political prisoners have been released. When I left South Africa, 41 had been released from Robben Island out of 41. Out of 500 or so on Robben Island. But political prisoners are interspersed throughout South Africa. There are some in Portsmouth, some in Johannesburg, others in other small prisons throughout South Africa. People who fit the definition of political prisoners as agreed upon between the Pretoria regime and ourselves. The Americans, of course, are saying that they don't want to shift the goalposts. If most of the conditions are met, they want to lift some of the sanctions. As to whether the regime will meet the April 30th deadline, I do not know. But I'm told they feel that they will meet that April 30th deadline.
The administration feels.
I think the administration has a feeling that the deadline will be met. And because I think in private discussions with Pretoria, they have been given that assurance. And General, Kubikutsi, Minister Kubikutsi and others have actually said they think that they will meet that deadline. We shall wait and see if that deadline is met or not.
Sir.
Simon Barber, Business Day. In the 1990 annual State Department Human Rights Report refers to continued credible and reliable reports that the ANC continued to abuse and imprison dissidents in Tanzania and Zambia. There was not any mention made of Angola in this particular report. Can you comment on that first? Secondly, on a more specific issue, last year there were several ANC detainees who returned to South Africa, including Mr. Sipho Pulungwa, who was murdered in Transkei shortly after a press conference at which he had revealed abuses that had gone on in ANC camps. Just on the same issue, can you tell us when the people that the ANC are holding and that you have admitted are holding in camps will be returned to South Africa?
I'll begin with the question of detainees held by the ANC and provide all of you with a bit of background. I don't want to go into details. I said earlier that the Pretoria regime and ourselves have been locked in a bitter and bloody warfare. Certainly Pretoria has imprisoned not just a few hundreds but thousands of us on Robben Island, Portsmouth and other prisons. Secondly, Pretoria has executed some of our captured comrades, Solomon Mahlangu, Mkhwerane, Musolodi, Mtaung, and they have sentenced to life imprisonment. Thirdly, Pretoria has sent murder squads across the borders of South Africa to eliminate us. I said yesterday, or day before yesterday, that I was one of the victims of the murder squads on more than one occasion. Gabi certainly was eliminated by them in Harare, and so many of our people have been killed in Gaborone, in Swaziland, in Mozambique, in Lesotho, and many other centers. In that war, Pretoria has been sending scores and scores of agents to kill and poison us in the camps. We have intercepted and caught some of those agents. Dirk Coetzee, whose credibility, despite what the Harms Commission said, has been accepted by Justice Kriegler, that for years Pretoria has maintained a place called Flag Plus, which was a center for secret operations against us, and the activities included poisoning of ANC members. We had to defend ourselves to survive. We arrested people, including Olivia Forsyth, who is a confessed agent of the regime. There were many others who confessed. We had to keep them somewhere, and they were kept in a camp in northern Angola. That camp is no longer there since we moved from Angola. Over the last few years, we have been releasing many of these people. Some are studying and they have been reintegrated in our movement. They have been pardoned by us. Twala and the so-called dissidents who came back from South Africa were also released and sent to Tanzania. They fled to Kenya. That's why they came back to South Africa about a year ago. We are in the process, as soon as the necessary logistics are organized, to release those people, and we shall give them an option either to remain with us abroad or come back to South Africa. We shall certainly not prevent a single one of them from coming back to South Africa if those people so desire. Coming to the question of Phungula, he came back with a group and went to the Transkei and was killed in the Transkei. That killing was not organized by the African National Congress. Of all those dissidents, he's the only one who has been killed so far. But he was not killed on the instructions of the ANC as an organization. We made a public statement on this issue. And I don't think it is fair to blame us for the killing of Sipho Phungula in the Transkei. The Transkei government carried out its own investigations. I don't know the outcome of those investigations. And it was willing to discuss this issue with the South African regime. So all I can say is that we cannot be held responsible for the killing of Phungula.
Question over here.
Peter Hammond, Frontline Fellowship. Mr. Hani, for years ANC has claimed to represent the vast majority of black South Africans, yet despite the massive international media coverage on the foreign funding, substantial foreign funding you receive, and the aggressive membership drive this last year, according to press reports, the ANC has failed to sign up more than 200,000 members, yet the Inkatha Freedom Party of Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi has over 2.2 million paid-up card-carrying members. How then can the ANC continue to claim to represent the majority of what is in reality not even 1% of the people of South Africa? And secondly, as your organization has publicly allied itself with American foes such as dictators Castro, Saddam Hussein, and Gaddafi, why then should American taxpayers contribute tax dollars to your organization, which is involved in violence?
Well, I think the comparison is very unfair. Inkatha has been operating openly, I don't know for how many years, unharassed and unpersecuted by the state. In fact, the leader of Inkatha Freedom Party is the chief minister in a homeland created by Pretoria. The resources of that homeland are at his disposal. He has got offices in Ulundi. He gets his salary from the South African government. Most of his ministers are paid by the South African government. They have never been arrested, persecuted, or banned, banished, or exiled like ourselves. Unlike Mandela, he has enjoyed all the space to mobilize. Mandela, until last year, was in prison for 27 years. All the senior leadership of the ANC, for information, has never been able, until last year, to come back and build an organization inside South Africa. So I think the comparison is rather unfortunate. Inkatha is a sweetheart organization, loved by Pretoria, and not harassed at all. And they have never been involved in a struggle, in my own memory, against the South African government. They are like a church, as far as I'm concerned, which goes every day unmolested to preach the word of God. They preach the word of freedom without taking any action to ensure that freedom comes about. Then moving from there, I think your statistics are rather outdated. The ANC so far has got more than 500,000 members, and there's a drive to recruit more members into the ANC. I think that's an achievement, considering that we started building the ANC seriously in August last year. Yes, we're unbanned in February. But then you have got to build a core of leaders. They had just come out of prison. Others were abroad. We had to set interim structures. You must remember, we're an underground movement. An underground movement has got to be very, very small to survive. Now we're building a mass movement. And for us to have reached all the parts of South Africa in 8 months is an amazing achievement. You know, the membership in the Transkei alone is close to 30,000 within 8 months. Inkatha has had, I don't know when it was formed, but I think it has had more than 10 years to build itself, openly and unharassed. And why does the world expect us within 8 months to have, 2 million or 2.2 million paid up membership? But your own papers in South Africa, at any rate, I think Mr. Bob and others will agree, there have been polls to show that more South Africans, especially blacks, support the ANC, more than 42%, and only 6% support Inkatha. Those are not Mandela's polls or the polls of Maibuye or the African Communist, but bourgeois papers like the Star and others. Even Ken Owen, who doesn't like us, agrees that we enjoy majority support. Now, I think there is no doubt that we are a mass national movement. We are not a Natal-based or a Cape-based organization. We have got membership throughout the country, amongst all Africans, Zulus, Xhosa, Tswanas, amongst Indians, people of Asian origin, mixed race, and also amongst whites. There might be few whites in the ANC, but they are there. We are working closely. We are in alliance with a massive trade union federation, which supports the broad outlines of, broad policies of the movement. That is COSATU. Coming to your question, how can the ANC, if it associates and works with what you call dictators, Fidel Castro, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi? You know, the ANC is involved in a very serious struggle to overthrow apartheid. In that struggle, it needs the support of the international community. The people you call dictators have helped us with training. Poor Cuba has helped us in training our people and has provided equipment. It has given us scholarship to our students to study in Havana and other cities. Why should we reject that assistance? When the Americans were not so forthcoming in terms of training us and giving us anything at that time, the American government. Gaddafi has done the same thing to us, not only us, but the PAC, training and funding us as well. Those who suffer can't afford the luxury of not accepting assistance from those who are willing to support us. The Americans must look back into their own history. You did not hesitate to work with Stalin against Hitler. You were sending shipments of food and material via Murmansk and other ports in the Soviet Union in order to fight Hitler. Why should it be reprehensible on the part of the ANC to do the same, to have alliances so that it wages a successful struggle? I think we are unfair to the African National Congress. And I think the American taxpayers must not support us on the basis of choosing friends for us. I think you must respect our decisions to have our own friends. Please don't dictate to us. We must decide who our friends are. I think it's a bit of arrogance to tell us with whom we should associate. I mean, that's really patronizing, and I think the ANC doesn't like that.
Question right here.
Dirk Swart, die Burger, Cape Town. Which economic program do you suggest for South Africa? I got the impression yesterday that you depended on the communist program to execute the redistribution of wealth, which you would like to see. Is that right?
Well, I'm happy to meet you. I have got a Cape Townian background as well. I grew up in Stellenbosch and I enjoyed my stay there for a long time. Which economic program? Well, I think South Africans are discussing which is the best economic program to implement in a post-apartheid South Africa. Even non-Marxists are agreed that something has got to be done about the redistribution of wealth in our country. I know at any rate, I know that Professor Sampieter Blanche of Stellenbosch, who for a long time was a member of the Nationalist Party, I don't know if he still is, also agrees that in addressing the imbalances in our country, something has got to be done, something drastic. You know, we want to bring about social harmony in our country. And that social harmony is impossible if we do not redistribute wealth and resources. I'm not referring to vulgar equalization. All I'm saying is that every person in South Africa, at least we should try, that should be our objective, should have at least 3 meals a day, should have shelter, not the squatters' shacks, nor compounds. Every child must have access to proper schools. We must have the same medical facilities. How do we do that? I don't think we South Africans must look for models. But I think we have got a duty, if we have got to stop the current divisions, if we have got to heal the wounds of apartheid divisions, to balance things. Now, you are an Afrikaner. You have got your own history. You are part of the important national groups in our country. At one time, you were disadvantaged, sir. The British treated you as a second-class citizen. You were not given, your language was not given the same status as English. You were an ordinary farmer in the 30s and 40s and very poor, most of you. We are exactly in the same position as blacks. You know, I went back where I was born, where my mother is, as soon as I got into the country. She stays in only one hut. When I had to sleep there, she had to negotiate with neighbors to provide her newly arrived son with some shelter. I'm just using me as an example. Most of us are in that position, most blacks, in the rural areas and in the townships. Now, apartheid has decided not to provide housing for us. Now, you nationalized. It's only now that you are speaking about privatization. You nationalized Eskom, ISCO, SETS. You worked out affirmative programs to uplift the Afrikaner. You helped them with heavy subsidies to buy farms so that they should have land. The ANC says, equally, emerging out of a disastrous situation which has impoverished millions, the state must intervene. We cannot leave it to private enterprise to try to distribute resources. And certainly we want to nationalize enterprises like Eskom, ISCO, SETS. But at the same time, we say we are for a mixed economy. And in doing so, we must also take into consideration not to repeat the mistakes of Eastern Europe and Africa. I think we're all agreed about economic growth so that, more jobs should be there. And I'm sure when we nationalize, we shall take that into consideration. But essential services, those things which are needed by the people, like postal services, transport, electricity, a government must ensure that, you see, Mr. and Mrs. Average also get a slice of the cake. But we shall allow private enterprise to continue in our country. We shall continue to accept foreign investment. But of course, every government sits down to draw guidelines so that in the final analysis, the operations of conglomerates like Anglo-American, for instance, has committed a crime against our people. I'm sure you have been to the compounds. Despite, the accumulation of profits, the housing they have built for our people is not fit for animals. And the conditions, discriminatory conditions and labor practices are terrible. We as a government must ensure, we must set up guidelines for the operations of private enterprise as well as multinational corporations. Yes, profits will be allowed to be taken out, but at the same time, they've got an obligation towards the social upliftment of those who are participating in the operations of their companies. I think this is only, people say that nationalization has not worked anywhere. We don't have that history. We know that the British after the war nationalized, I'm sure the French as well. There's a bit of nationalization in the Scandinavian countries as well. Our nationalization, in fact, is guided by a concern to bring about social justice. Our capitalism, I said so when I was speaking yesterday, has never demonstrated a social conscience. I don't know the situation in other countries. That's why, as I say, we are for a mixed economy. But again, I want to assure whites in South Africa, we have no intentions to nationalize private property. They will remain in their houses. Some people are so simplistic. They think that next time there's an ANC government, we are going to be rushing to grab people's cars. We are going to be grabbing people's houses. In our constitutional guidelines, we are emphatic that private property is private property, and every South African will retain his or her private property. And I think this assurance should be satisfying to those who possess houses, beautiful cars, and that sort of thing. We are only concerned about the commanding heights of our economy.
Hang on, let's get it here and then first.
I wondered if you could comment for me on the relationship between the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress and the importance of progressive whites in South Africa as well as the United States to respect the range of leadership in Azania.
Thanks. Well, after years of differences between the PAC and the ANC, I don't want to go into that history. But the leadership of both organizations have recognized the vital necessity to build a united front. We had a number of meetings within South Africa, and those meetings resulted in a major meeting in Harare, which was an outstanding success in our view. We defined areas of common agreement. The PAC and the ANC are agreed on a constituent assembly. We agreed that this government has no right to rule us. There's a need for democratic elections so that a new democratic government should emerge in our country. We're having now a very important meeting in August to discuss questions of strategy and tactics. You have referred to progressive whites in our country. As you know, we're a non-racial organization. In the leadership of the ANC at different levels, we've got all sorts of people. In the national executive of the ANC, we have the men some whites don't like, George Slovo. We have Ronnie Castrels. At a number of levels, we've got people like Raymond Satner, Albisex, so on and so forth, because I think we're the only truly non-racial political organization. Well, I think President de Klerk is learning very fast from us. He's opening the Nationalist Party doors as well. But we started this process years ago. But we're proud that now other parties are following suit. We are very much keen that our South African white counterparts, or compatriots rather, should be inside the ANC, because the future of our country lies in non-racialism, in building a real non-racial country, where we should forget about the color of a person's skin. We believe, for instance, we should cultivate these things right from school, primary schools, nursery schools, and in a small way, grudgingly perhaps, some schools are being reopened. And I think, you see, this is commendable, to break the racial divide, for South Africans to put together and talk to one another, because this has not happened for many, many years. Nobody should feel threatened in our country. You know, before, there would be the white areas, white suburbs, in convenient places. There would be the townships 30 kilometers from the city. You know, in order to get to town from Orlando, in Soweto, where I stay, I've got to make sure that at least 30 minutes are spent, you know, commuting between Orlando and Johannesburg. Surely we want to bring that to an end. And that is not going to happen by, you know, and forcing people to move into the suburbs. So we've got to build more houses. We've got to encourage people. We're not going to legislate, you see, for a mechanical mixing of people. Because what is important is education and reorientation of the people of South Africa, in order to, so that they accept themselves, they look upon themselves as people of South Africa, not as white, black, Indian, or colored. I think that is the major task facing all of us, to build a contented, united, non-racial society.
Question here.
David Brown of the Johannesburg Star, the newspaper you described as bourgeois. The ANC and the others, it's well known, are pretty disgruntled with the South African media. Could you say what the nature of the complaint is and what the ANC government or dominated government would like to do about it in the post-apartheid South Africa? And secondly, if I may ask, did the administration in your talks yesterday show any sign of flexibility or sympathy towards your view on sanctions, or are they going to go ahead?
Well, I think the word disgruntled is rather too strong. I think we've criticized the press, but equally I want to say, and I said this in an interview with New Era in Cape Town, that the press has an important role to play in society. They've got to inform the people about what is happening. They've got to critically assess the ANC, Nationalist Party, Inkatha, and all players in the South African situation. We don't want a press which is going to indulge in acts of adulation, saying what a great leader Mandela is. I don't think that sort of sycophantic press is useful. But I think sometimes the press has been rough with us. One day, I was in Cape Town and I read an editorial in the Cape Times which said, Hani and Malan. And the first sentence was rather unfair, which said the highly ambitious Hani is being helped by the outbursts of Malan. Well, unfortunately, I've never met the editor. And I don't know why he should use that epithet when he's describing me. But I suppose that that's the prerogative of the press, to say whether you have got a big nose or a big head, even if you don't have it. We believe that they have not treated us sympathetically. Even over the years, this is history. You must remember that invariably the press sided with the government, and with all the pernicious legislation for a long time against us. You regarded us generally as terrorists, as bloody people. When you were attacked in Lesotho and Mozambique, you said to Malan and his troops, well done, our boys have knocked them out. They will never be able to continue again. They have been hit for a 6. You never treated us as individuals, as human beings who had a noble cause. But there were exceptions. I don't want to generalize too much. But I think that was the view. For instance, some of you are predicting a doomsday, that South Africa will be a real wasteland if the ANC rules that country. And you don't say that South Africa has been reduced to its present position by the Nationalist Party government. You don't treat us sympathetically when we cry and say that we see we're being killed, we're being attacked. You think we're behaving like spoiled brats. In fact, people like Ken Owen are actually enjoying attacking us every weekend. Ken Owen on Sunday, I think most of the time is 2/3 of what he says is a tirade against the African National Congress. We don't want to see a situation where we feel that the press doesn't like us, because that situation generates negative attitudes on the part of the ANC, and I don't think that is helpful. I think there should be a balanced and objective assessment of the ANC, in the same way as I think we are objective about the government. Very few papers, there are papers you see would describe Malan in the way sometimes I'm described, in the way sometimes Paulo Jordan is described, or in the way that Slovo is described. We are projected, as people who are not reasonable. For instance, where does the press get the view that the demands made by the ANC are as a result of the hawks in the ANC? You don't see the ANC sitting down like an organization discussing openly and at the end taking a collective decision as a result of openness. That was a decision taken as a result of a consensus. But again, the whipping boys, Jordan, Slovo, Hani, pressurizing Mandela to write an open letter to de Klerk. All personal, I'm appealing, and I'm not prescribing, you see, to the press. We need the press, you see. It should inform us as much as possible. The press, for instance, I don't like, for instance, today I was reading a press transcript from home, which says Inkatha, which is largely Zulu, and the ANC, which is largely supported by the Xhosas. That is not true again. The ANC is supported by all the national groups, all blacks in South Africa. And if you go to statistics, you'll find that probably 70%, 70% Xhosa, 65% Sotho, 55% Tswana. The latest statistics say that 58% of Zulu support the ANC. And you are projecting an image that the ANC is a tribal organization. When we eschewed tribalism years ago, for a long time there was not a single Xhosa president of the ANC. It was Luthuli, it was Dube, it was Josiah Gumede, it was Makgato. So we don't understand why are we being described, for instance, as a Xhosa organization, except that the perception should be, well, Inkatha is Zulu and Xhosa, and the ANC is Xhosa, and that is totally untrue. So I'm just citing a few examples which cause us unhappiness, not disgruntlement. I don't think we're disgruntled.
We've got time for about one more question in the back.
Yeah, as you know, the big business press in the United States as well as South Africa talks about, as a refrain constantly, black-on-black violence and so on and so forth. I was wondering if you could report to us any progress that has been made in the discussions between the African National Congress leadership and Inkatha in terms of fighting against the violence that's taking place in the townships, and also any new information as to the role of the police and the state apparatus in instigating that violence, and finally also just any support that has been able to be won over. And I think it's very important what you just said about the statistics of support for the ANC among the Zulus. If you could go into more information on that. I'm with the Militant newspaper, and nice to see you and welcome you here.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, the violence in South Africa is being described as black-on-black violence. One asks the question, why is it being described so? what do people want to achieve by calling violence black on black violence? Why don't we say there's violence in South Africa, where people are dying and getting killed? Do we get any satisfaction when we call it black on black violence? In the past, there's been a lot of violence by the whites against us throughout the history of our country. And there's never been a phrase of white violence on the blacks. Secondly, I think, you see, people should not exculpate apartheid from responsibility for dividing our society into tribal groupings. Of course, the basic motive was divide and conquer. Residentially, blacks were separated. There were Xhosa section, Zulu section, Venda section. In other words, we stoked ethnic suspicion. And also the socio-economic conditions contribute to violence. And the press is very quiet. The international press is quiet about the socio-economic conditions in our country. The life in the hostel is dreary and subhuman. The life in the squatter shacks where thousands of our people are staying is without basic facilities. No clean water, no electricity, no roads, and sometimes no basic sanitation. Put people in those conditions, whether they are white, green, or black, and there will be crime, there will be gangs. Let's say, for instance, if those people in the hostels had decent home with their families, children and wives, none of them would be going, carrying sticks with red bands on their heads and attacking commuters as they did yesterday morning at Intlazane railway station in Johannesburg. I'm not saying there are no exceptions to the rule, there might be a few people, but it wouldn't be a common thing. Now, coming to the question of the role of the state, and I want to say there's no agreement. The state has categorically denied its involvement. But people in the townships in Thokoza, Katlehong, Vereeniging, the affected people have come out with stories of the presence of the whites, some whites, helping the attackers. This information has been made available to Mr. Flock and others, but they've denied. They've denied the truth of these allegations. But we are saying the police are not taking measures. And we understand why they are doing so as the ANC. There's the question of basic orientation for years of the South African police. They were fed on racist poison. As a young person, when I saw a police van in Langa Township, I would run for my dear life. Because it was our understanding that we could be arrested for anything by the South African police. One day I was sleeping at Langa Township. I just finished my university education. And it was my first experience to be in a police van. They were raiding all the townships house to house. I did not have a permit to be in Cape Town. And I had to be there. And it was 3 in the morning. Look at that humiliation. They were rounding all the townships. We finally reached the police station at 8. And I was taken to prison for not producing a reference book. In other words, a kafir was not regarded as a human being. It's only a few years that the Nationalist Party has begun to say that we're human beings. And they had trained their police on that basis. If, for instance, there was a group at demonstration, they would just wade into us with sticks, with batons and everything. That mentality is still there, not with everybody, but a big number of the police officers harbor animosity towards the ANC, the PACE, and other organizations. They see us as having been responsible for the death of some of their colleagues. And I think some of them want to settle accounts. Secondly, for a long time, where men of violence were to be destroyed in any way, and there would be no accountability. The government in South Africa has not taken major steps to re-educate that police force. Hence, you see, when blacks are killing one another, as they say, oh, let those kafirs, let those baboons, popoyan in Afrikaans, let them kill one another. And apart from, as far as I'm concerned, pious statements by their leaders, I don't see a program to re-educate and redirect the police. And that program can't be carried out only by the government. Other organizations, the churches, it's a major educational program. Because in order for the police to be effective in a community, at least they must have an acceptance rate of at least 60%, 70%. Otherwise, their work becomes difficult. And I'm not exaggerating, when a Casper appears, there are two reactions. Either you run away or you try to throw a stone at them, because you see them as the enemy. Because they have behaved as an enemy, as an army of occupation in the past. And I think that is the major problem. If those police are going to cope with that work, they must be overhauled, re-educated. Because unfortunately, we depend on them. There's no other force in our country, at least to maintain law and order.
Mr. Hani has to get on to another appointment. Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen.
That concludes our coverage of remarks by Chris Hani. For more information, you may contact McKinney & McDowell Associates at 1419 V Street, Northwest in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20009. Up next, it's live coverage of the United States Senate.